Welcome back, my brilliant little wanderers of the timeline. It is I, Grandpa Gus, historian, time-traveling troublemaker, and the only man who has accidentally ordered a latte in the Bronze Age. Today, I'm standing on a dusty ridge overlooking a very familiar landscape. You know the one. Mountains on one side, sea on the other, the faint smell of sweat, fear, and olive oil floating through the air. Yes, we're back at Thermopylae in 480 BC, right in the middle of what historians later called the Second Persian War. But this time, we are not here to talk about the 300 Spartans. Don't get me wrong, they were magnificent, brave, disciplined, carved out of marble and stubbornness. But history has a habit of shrinking crowds into symbols, and Thermopylae's crowd was far bigger than 300. You see, Hollywood took the 7,000 Greeks who fought here when the Persians arrived on August 17th and tossed them into the credits like background extras. But Grandpa Gus will not stand for this historical injustice. Those men held the hot gates for 2 full days before the Spartans made their famous last stand on August 19th, 480 BC. Without them, this battlefield would have been nothing more than a footnote. So grab your sandals, polish your shields, and let Grandpa Gus introduce you to the 7,000 forgotten heroes of Thermopylae. Before we go further, let me rewind your timelines a bit. The Persians didn't just show up one morning and say, "Let's go for a jog into Greece." No, this whole saga began decades earlier. In 490 BC, King Darius I tried to punish Athens and Eretria for supporting the Ionian revolt. That attempt ended rather embarrassingly at the Battle of Marathon, where 10,000 Athenians led by Themistocles humiliated Persia's invasion, prompting Darius to swear revenge. He died in 486 BC before he could return, and his son, Xerxes I, inherited the grudge, the empire, and the biggest army ever assembled. Thus began the Second Greco-Persian War, 480 to 479 BC, which brought us right here to this narrow, sweaty, olive oil-flavored pass. The reason these men get forgotten is simple. The story of 300 fighting to the death is cinematic gold. It's the kind of thing storytellers latch onto because it's clean, dramatic, and easy to remember. 300 against a million. Sounds like something a poet from the 5th century BC would make up after too much wine. But the truth is more complex. Thermopylae was not just a Spartan show, it was a Greek coalition. 7,000 men from cities scattered across Greece marched here willingly, knowing full well what stood before them. The largest invading army the world had ever seen, crossing the Hellespont on Xerxes' pontoon bridges earlier that same spring. They weren't trained like Spartans. They didn't grow up in the Agora. Some were farmers, potters, fishermen, and shepherds. And yet, here they stood, shoulder to shoulder with Sparta's finest, defending a pass so narrow you could almost leap across it. History remembers the last stand. But Grandpa Gus remembers the first stand and the men who made it possible. Let's take a moment to appreciate just how diverse this Greek force was. Sparta contributed its famous 300 royal guard, yes. But they did not come alone. City-states like Corinth, Arcadia, Phocis, Malice, Achaea, and others all sent troops after the formation of the Hellenic League in 481 BC. Some cities sent hundreds, others sent thousands. The single largest contingent wasn't even Spartan. It came from the city of Thespians, which brought 700 men who refused to retreat even at the end. Imagine the scene here before the battle. Thousands of men speaking different dialects, wearing different styles of armor, bickering about whose goat cheese was better, and wondering quietly whether they were about to die. But as soon as the Persian banners appeared on the horizon, all their differences vanished. They became a single army, Greeks defending Greece. They did not come for glory. They came because the alternative was Persian rule, a reality already experienced by the Ionian Greeks on the coast of Asia Minor since the late 6th century BC, and the mainland Greeks valued freedom more than life itself. Movies and myths focus so heavily on the last stand that most people think the Spartans fought alone from the beginning. But those first 2 days belonged to the coalition. The Spartans were the anchor, yes, but the rest of the Greeks formed the rest of the line, and without their numbers, the pass would have collapsed before the story even began. Imagine thousands of Persian infantry charging down this narrow pass, confident their sheer mass would crush the defenders. Now, imagine those same Persians slammed to a halt by a wall of Greek hoplites packed so tightly they could feel each other's breath on the backs of their necks. The Spartans took the front during the heaviest assaults, but the other Greeks rotated through the line. They absorbed the brunt of the archers, withstood the fatigue of constant shoving matches, and held formation against foes who outnumbered them 50-1. The phalanx is a beautiful thing when done correctly. Shields overlapping, spears braced. Each man's life is tied to the life of the man beside him, and for 2 days straight the coalition made that formation dance. You've heard of Spartan discipline. Now picture farmers and fishermen matching that discipline under unbearable pressure. That is the part history brushes aside, but Grandpa Gus will not. Those 2 days were a miracle, and they belong to the 7,000. Among all the cities represented here, none deserves more praise than the Thespians. These men marched alongside Leonidas willingly, not because they were obligated, but because they believed defending Greece was worth any sacrifice. When the betrayal arrived, when the Persians discovered the mountain path that would outflank the Greeks, Leonidas dismissed the coalition so they could fight another day, but the Thespians refused. Their commander, Demophilus, led 700 men who chose to stay with the Spartans. They knew this meant certain death. They knew their city, small and vulnerable, would pay the price for their loss. And yet, they stood their ground because they believed dying in defense of Greece was a duty, not a tragedy. In many ways, the Thespians were the beating heart of Thermopylae's heroism. They fought not for fame, not for mythical reputation, but because they believed in something greater than themselves. If the Spartans were the iron, the Thespians were the fire that made that iron glow. Now here's a part of the story people rarely hear. While everyone else was defending the main pass, 1,000 Phocians were stationed on the mountain trail to prevent the Persians from sneaking around. Now, you may say, Gus, if the Phocians were guarding the path, how did the Persians get through? And that is a fair question, but remember, this was a wooded, winding trail, hard to defend, easy to ambush. The Phocians were surprised by Persian archers who rained arrows down upon them. In that moment of chaos, they retreated to a higher defensive position, believing the Persians' aim was to wipe them out. But Xerxes wasn't interested in killing Phocians. He wanted to flank Leonidas, and so the Persians continued forward, leaving the Phocians isolated rather than annihilated. It is easy to scold them for failing to hold the path, but Grandpa Gus prefers to admire their courage. They were not Spartans, they were not professional warriors, yet they stood on that mountain ready to face any enemy who came their way. They held the path long enough to force the Persians into a grueling march rather than an easy stroll, and that delay, small as it may seem, mattered. History is generous to the flawless, but rarely kind to those who falter. Grandpa Gus, however, likes to remember that courage is not perfection. Courage is standing your ground even when you know you may be overwhelmed. For every famous Greek soldier, there were hundreds whose names were never written down. These were the men from cities you've forgotten or perhaps never heard of. Trachinians, Opuntians, Locrians, Malian volunteers, Corinthian hoplites, Arcadian farmers, men who had livelihoods, families and dreams that had nothing to do with dying in a narrow pass. And yet they fought like veterans. The entire concept of a unified Greek identity was still new at this point in history. Greece wasn't a nation. It was a quilt of bickering city-states held together by shared language and shared gods. The idea that Greeks from dozens of regions would fight as one army was still astonishing. And here, at Thermopylae, they became one. The Spartans could not have held the pass alone. Without the thousands of shields pressing behind them, without the other hoplites rotating through the line, without the chorus of courage behind their spear points, the pass would have fallen by midday on the first day. These unnamed soldiers were the heartbeat of the battle. They were the unsung backbone that kept the phalanx from breaking. They deserve monuments of their own. When Ephialtes betrayed the Greeks and revealed the mountain path, Leonidas realized the main defense could no longer hold. He had a decision to make. Should he withdraw everyone and save their lives? Or should a portion remain behind to slow the Persians long enough for the Greek fleet to prepare for the decisive naval battle that would soon follow at Salamis in September 480 BC? Leonidas chose sacrifice. But this sacrifice was not limited to Spartans alone. Many of the 7,000 wanted to remain. Some were forced to leave by their commanders. Others marched away heartbroken, knowing their comrades would not survive the day. Their retreat was not cowardice, it was a strategy. They lived to fight again in battles that would ultimately free Greece. Plataea in 479 BC, Mycale shortly after. Without these retreating troops, later victories would have been impossible. Yet, as they walked away, they knew who they owed their lives to. The men who stayed: Spartan, Thespian, Theban. But the bravery of the 7,000 who fought the first 2 days? That courage is what made the final stand meaningful. And now, we come to the great injustice of history. People remember the 300, they quote their lines, they carve statues of them. But the 7,000, they dissolve into the background like they were never here. Yet without them, the story of Thermopylae collapses. The Persian army would have overwhelmed a lone Spartan unit immediately. The pass would have fallen. Greece would have lost valuable time. The naval battle of Salamis might never have happened. Western civilization might look very different today. Thermopylae was not just a one-act play starring Spartans. It was a sweeping ensemble performance featuring Greeks from across the peninsula. They fought united in a way Greece had rarely been united before. If the Spartans were the symbol of defiance, the 7,000 were the substance. So, my brave little travelers, remember this the next time you hear the legend of the 300. The Spartans were magnificent, yes, but they were not alone. They stood with farmers, potters, fishermen, shepherds, merchants and craftsmen. They stood with men from cities poorer, smaller and less famous. They stood with fellow Greeks whose names will never appear in movies or textbooks, but Grandpa Gus remembers them. The lesson of Thermopylae is not that 300 men changed the world, it is that thousands did, together. The 7,000 who fought here gave Greece the time it needed to survive. Their courage deserves to echo through the ages. Well then, my friends, shall we travel to our next chapter? I hear there's a philosopher in Athens who keeps insisting the earth is round. Let's go find him before someone makes him drink hemlock. Grandpa Gus, signing off and saluting the forgotten heroes of Thermopylae.